As we go from there on out, they'll go faster and faster and faster, okay? So we're laying some groundwork here for the very foundations of our faith. And this is one of those stories that many people would consider to be one of the most important stories in the Bible, the story of the Exodus. But it's also been important for us to see how we got here. And the way we get here to the story of the Exodus is Jacob and his family. Jacob, who's also known as, what's his other name that God renamed him? Israel. Good. So Jacob, who also is known as Israel, and his family, they end up in Egypt, and we learn how that transpired and how all of that was orchestrated by God. And they ended up being in Egypt for about 400 years, the Bible tells us. And so if you look at Exodus chapter 1 and you look at verse 7, it tells us, but the people of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly, and they multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them. Does that language there remind you of anything you've heard before, that we've talked about before? That language of be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth. So this is also another reminder. Every time you see that, it's a reminder of God's project for new creation, to bring about new creation, to a new beginning for the world. And this story is a part of God doing that. It goes all the way back to the very, very beginning. You know, when we first started out, we started talking about a lot of different things, but one of the things we talked about was the story of the Tower of Babel. We talked about how the Tower of Babel was probably one of these kinds of structures. This is actually an ancient structure from Ur of the Chaldees or near Babylonia. Do you know, have we heard about anybody from the place called Ur? There's a man who came from Ur, and he ended up, his dad actually led his family to Haran, and then from Haran they went on, he went on with his family, his wife, on into, eventually down into Canaan, but also into Egypt and back up into Canaan. Y'all remember the man? He's very important. Abraham. His father was Terah, moved from Ur. So this is an ancient structure from Ur. And so this is called a ziggurat in the ancient world. This stair step was supposed to be a connection point between heaven and earth, between the gods and humans. But the point for the ancient pagans was to try to gain control over the heavens. Remember the story of the Tower of Babel? They wanted to make a name for who? Themselves. But the point about there needing to be a reconnection between heaven and earth is still true, still valid. It's only that in the biblical story, it's not humans that are going to do this through their own efforts. It's that God is going to make this reconnection. So when we remember last week we talked about the story of Jacob's ladder. He saw the angels of God descending and ascending on the ladder, and then he saw God at the top of the ladder revealing himself more fully to him in that story. So remember the story, the whole story of the Bible is about this reconnection, going back to that connection that was lost in the Garden of Eden, right? And God's intent in that story of the Garden of Eden was that was a space and a place where heaven and earth were in perfect harmony, where the will of God and the will of humans was in perfect harmony for that period of time, however long it was. And God's intention for them was to be fruitful, to multiply, to fill the earth. And He intended the project was for humanity to fill the entire world with His glory. But that plan was aborted because of rebellion and sin. And the big differences between the story of the Bible and the story of the ancient pagans is that the pagans believed in gods who were less than the universe, who were unpredictable, who were often irritable, and moody, and who would sometimes be in a good mood, sometimes they're not in a good mood. So they had practices and things that they developed through guidance from divine or spiritual beings who led them astray into practicing magic and rituals and different things to try to gain the favor. The best way to think about it is, and I hope you haven't done this, but even if you have, it's okay. We've all made mistakes. But, if someone has, people that they work for, they have bosses over them, people may try to do things for those bosses to gain their favor. There's a term for it, brown nosing, right? So the ideas of the ancient pagans about the gods, little g gods, was that they could do certain things to kind of smooth them, to get them on their side, to gain their favor. But it's not like that with this God of the Bible. First of all, He's greater than the universe. He's the creator of all things, and He is not under the influence or control of anything in the universe. See, the whole point of the practice of magic, and we've heard that come up a lot in the book of Acts, if you really think about it. It's come up quite a bit. But the whole point of the practice of magic and the ancient practices of idolatry and all of those things was to gain the favor or to do things that will bring the favor of the gods on their side, to bring them luck, and so on and so forth. So the idea is that there's this force. Think Star Wars, okay? Anybody watch Star Wars here? So the force. Now, when they talk about the force in Star Wars, does it sound anything like a personal being? It's not a he, it's not a she, it's an it, right? And that it, whatever it is, they think that they can manipulate that force to get the gods, who are semi-personal beings, not really, on their side and in their favor. Get the forces of the universe lined up in their favor. And so people still think like that today. And a lot of times in Christian circles, in Christian churches, they have reverted back to that way of thinking. And they're using like prayers as formulas and using sayings as formulas to try to bring what some in some New Age circles, what they would call, what is the term that they use? There's a practice. It's called. There's a lady that came out with a book called The Secret. Oprah had her on many years ago. I think her name was Rhonda Byrne. And it's doing things and saying things in just a certain way to attract. Yeah, that's it. The law of attraction. The law of attraction. That's what it is. To get the forces of the universe lined up in your favor to bring you luck. So that was what all of the pagan rituals were really about. Okay, but the God of the Bible is not able to be manipulated in that way. He is the creator of all things. He's greater than all things. And what has disrupted the connection between heaven and earth is not that humans, just haven't done enough to schmooze the gods, but it's actually humans have rebelled against their purpose and design in creation. And their purpose and designed by the Creator. So that is at the heart of the difference between the Bible and a lot of other things. So at any rate, so this connection, reestablishing that connection, is not going to happen by way of manipulating forces, controlling things on our own. It's becoming aware that we are creatures created by the Creator of all things, who created us for a relationship and created us for specific purpose and for specific design, and to live in harmony with Him and in His will. And it's sin that's disrupted that. And that's what's going to, fixing that problem is what's going to reestablish, that connection. So that be fruitful, multiply, replenish the earth. You're hearing a reminder of that in Exodus right here in chapter 1, verse 7. In verse 8, it says, "Now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph." That doesn't mean he didn't know anything about Joseph, but he just didn't care about Joseph. He didn't care about Joseph, and he didn't care about Joseph's people. Exodus chapter 1, verse 8. "And he said to his people, Behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply, and if war breaks out, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land." So this king begins to become paranoid and suspicious about the people of Israel, and he is concerned and he's alarmed that they're growing in their population numbers so rapidly. And so this is a concern for population control. He wants to control the population, and as we'll see, he wants to control the reproduction of this population. And so, but God has commanded his people and commanded all people to be fruitful, to multiply, to replenish, to fill the earth. And so, therefore, he comes up with this plan to enslave them. So he wants to control them. And the wickedness of the human heart leads to this desire to look at other people as objects to be used, and rather than people to be loved and to have relationship with. So we have the tendency to become so enamored with pleasures and things that we see people as objects for our benefit, to use them to get to the pleasure or to the things that we desire. And this is what you see in the wicked heart of this particular Pharaoh, this king of Egypt. And so he enslaves them. And then they continue, even though he's oppressing them and using them in this way, ruthlessly. He made them work as slaves, it says in verse 13 there. And he made their lives bitter, it says, with hard service. And so in verse 15, the king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, these were the people who were going to be delivering the Hebrew babies, one of whom was named Sapphira and the other Puah, and says, "When you serve as midwife to the Hebrew women and see them on their birth stool, if it is a son, you shall kill him. But if it is a daughter, she shall live." So this is another means of this population control, infanticide. They didn't have the ability to do abortions like we do today, so they would just kill the baby. Often in the ancient world, it would be through just allowing them to be exposed and not to give them care, to let them die, to die of exposure from the elements, or to be the prey of wild animals. It was horrific. Okay, this was a very common practice throughout the ancient world, throughout the history of the ancient world, even on into the days of the Roman Empire. It was still a big, huge part of what they did. So this is pretty gruesome here. So he's telling these Israelite midwives to kill their own people. But they refuse, because they fear God more than they fear this Pharaoh. They refuse to do this. And so all of this is a means of controlling this population because of his fear, his paranoia, and his desire, for control. But this is going to set him at odds with the will of God, whose will is for his people to be fruitful, to multiply, and to fill the earth. And it's his will for all people to be fruitful, to multiply, and to fill the earth. And so in chapter 2, we read about the story of this particular baby who was going to be the son of Levi. And he was about to be born, and his family and his sister and his mother conspired to save his life, to try to protect him from this edict from the Roman Empire. And so after he was born, to save his life, and it doesn't tell us all of the details and everything that was going on, but they decided to put him into a basket, an ark, kind of hearkening back to the story of who, right? Noah and his family, to preserve, to save. And he ends up being, and they could see how all of this might play out. The daughter of Pharaoh, the daughter of the king, sees this little baby, and has compassion for the baby, and she saves the baby, and she wants to raise the baby as her own. And then Moses' sister, Miriam, that we'll hear about later, she goes and she says, hey, I can find a Hebrew midwife for you. And so she's able to go back and get the child's very own mother to be, not the midwife, but to be the nurse, for the wet nurse for the baby, to be able to feed and to raise the baby. But he would be raised in the household of the king of Egypt as Pharaoh's daughter. And he would know this. And so in chapter 2, after the story of his saving from rescue, in verse 11 it says, one day when Moses had grown up, he went out to his people, and he looked on their burdens, and he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his people. And he looked this way and in that, and seeing no one, he struck down the Egyptian. So he had an affinity for his own people and to protect his own people here already. And so to protect one of his own people, he killed an Egyptian. Well, this caused him to become a fugitive. And so he had to flee. He had to flee Egypt to protect his own life, because he knew that wouldn't be something that was going to work out well for him. So he ends up fleeing to a place called Midian. Now, I'm going to kind of get us oriented here. This is a modern day map, and again, y'all can't see anything back. If y'all are like me, you can't see anything back there. So if you might want to come up a little closer. But over here on this side, you can see Iran, you can see Iraq here, you see the Persian Gulf. This is Saudi on the other side of Egypt, the other side of the Red Sea. It's Saudi Arabia. Kind of get situated. You can see Egypt here, the Nile River. You see the Red Sea here. Syria, Afghanistan, Turkey, to kind of get us situated in modern day terms, in terms of geography. But here's this ancient map, and we started with Abraham coming from over here, Ur of the Chaldees, to Haran with his father Terah and their family, and then from Haran down into this area. This is Jerusalem about right here. Of course, you see Egypt right here, so he spent time in Egypt and back up here, and then the family of Jacob, Isaac's son, and his kids end up in Egypt for 400 years. So that's kind of where we are in the whole geography of things. And this is a map that focuses in on Egypt and Sinai and the Red Sea right there, to kind of help get us situated in terms of where we are in the story, in terms of the history and also geography here. So Moses has to flee, and he flees to Midian. Midian's over here on this corner, if you can see that. And he's there in Midian for quite a while, a number of decades. And he ends up being married and having children in Midian and working as a shepherd in Midian. And then if you will, take a look at Exodus chapter 2 at the end of here. Chapter 2, verse 23, it says, during those many days the king of Egypt died, and the people of Israel groaned because of their slavery and cried out for help. Their cry for rescue because of the slavery that they were under from slavery came up to God. In verse 24, and God heard their groaning, and God remembered what? His covenant. That's that promise. Part of that promise he made with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. The storyline is in the what? Family line. The storyline is in the family line. And God saw the people of Israel, and God knew. Saying God saw them, and he knew the plight that they were in, and he knew what he was going to do. So verse 1 of chapter 3, it says, now Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jephthah, the priest of Midian. And as he led his flock to the west side of the wilderness, he came to Horeb, the mountain of God over in the Sinai area. You see over here in the Sinai, Midian, and the Sinai area. And verse 2, and the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of the midst of the bush. And he looked, and behold, the bush was burning, yet it was not consumed. So this was an intriguing sign for him that got his attention. And Moses said, I will turn aside to see this great sight, why the bush is not burned. And when the Lord saw that he turned aside to see, God called to him out of the bush, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here I am. Then he said, Do not come near. Take your sandals off your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. So this is indicating, here's a holy place because there's a reconnection here again between the presence of God and this space here on earth. And he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. Then the Lord said to him, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and I have heard their cry. And because of their taskmasters, I know their sufferings. And I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them out of the land to a good and a broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. He's reminding of this promise that he had made to all of these ancestors over 400 years before, that he was going. Part of the promise was that they would receive land. And this harkens us back. If you look at Genesis, hold your finger there, look at Genesis 15 again, and remember Genesis 15. When God establishes and ratifies this covenant that he has established with Abraham here, he tells them, God tells Abram, before he's known as Abraham, he says in chapter 15, verse 13, Then the Lord said to Abram, Know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs, and will be slaves there. And they will be afflicted for 400 years. But I will bring judgment on the nation that they serve, and afterward they shall come out with great possessions. And as for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace, and you shall be buried in a good old age. And they shall come back here in the fourth generation, for the iniquity of the Amorites, and this is just using Amorites as a broad term for all of these Canaanite peoples, the iniquity or the sin of the Amorites is not yet full or complete. Your translation may say different thing there, but complete or full. So the idea here, a lot of times when people read the Old Testament, they see there's a lot of judgment. You see it with the story, Adam and Eve. You see it with Cain and Abel. You see it, with Noah, that generation around Noah. There's a lot of judgment. What they often do, they jump to the conclusion that God is just quick to judge. But what the Bible actually shows us in all sorts of different ways, as we'll see, is that God is a gracious God. And He's slow to anger. And He is abounding in steadfast what? Love. So God is a patient God. But there is a point at which sin and iniquity and rebellion and evil can reach a tipping point. And so God allows the Canaanites 400 years. This is the time where the time is now full for Israel to be delivered out of Egypt and go into the Promised Land. So we have to remember as we're going through the story, especially when we get to the book of Joshua, is that the book of Joshua, when they actually go in and conquer the land of the Canaanites, it's not like it just came out of nowhere. Like all of a sudden they just decided, hey, let's just go take over this land. It was a long time in the coming, and we'll talk about how all of that worked out here. So God is now ready to trigger the fulfillment of that promise. So if you go back to Exodus chapter 3. And so he's calling Moses here. He's revealing himself to Moses here more fully. We'll go to verse 13 in chapter 3, and it says, Then Moses said to God, If I come to the people of Israel and say to them, The God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, What is his name? What shall I say to them? So this is a key passage. Highlight it, underline it, write it down. What shall I say to them? And God said to Moses, I am who I am. This is the name of God. He's revealing to Moses. This is the essence of who God is. I am who I am. This phrase, I am who I am, is the foundation for the name, and I'll write it on the board here. Yahweh. And Yahweh is just, it's the, at the root of it is the verb that just means to be, to exist. God is the one who is self-existent. He is the one whose existence depends on nothing else outside of Himself. He is the ground of being itself, and He is a personal being. And He has a name. His name is I am who I am, and Yahweh is at the center of that. Now, in a lot of English translations, and we won't go into all the details, this was spelled, instead of Yahweh, it was spelled, anybody know? Jehovah, have y'all heard that, right? Same thing. It's actually just a misspelling. It is. It's just a misspelling of Yahweh. And so I won't get into all those details. This is the big picture study, not the detail study. So we won't get into all those details. So God is revealing Himself to Moses. Now Moses is maybe, he's heard, but he doesn't know personally. He doesn't have that personal knowledge of God. So God is revealing Himself in a deep and profound way here. And God said to Moses, I am who I am. And He said, say to this people of Israel, I am has sent me. So the name of God, I am, is very key here. So God also said to Moses, say to this people of Israel, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. The storyline is in the what? Family line. Y'all are weak on that. The storyline is in the family line. Has sent me to you, and this is my name forever, and thus I am to be remembered throughout all generations. Go and gather the elders of Israel together and say to them, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, has appeared to me, saying, I have observed you and what has been done to you in Egypt. And I promise that I will bring you out of the affliction of Egypt to the land of the Canaanites, the Hittites, and the Amorites, and the Perizzites, and so on and so forth. And so God is going to be calling Moses to go and to be His representative, to call the people to be ready to come out of Egypt. But Moses is a reluctant deliverer. He's a reluctant messenger. Chapter 4 gets into some of the details of how God has to alleviate Moses has a lot of self-doubt. Have any of you ever had any self-doubt? Right? So he has a lot of self-doubt. Moses probably literally had a speech impediment. He probably had something that caused him to talk really poorly. And he would have been educated and he would have understood language, but there was something that prohibited him from speaking well. So when God's calling him, Moses is wondering, hey, don't you think you might have the wrong number here, God? You sure you got to be thinking about somebody else. So verse 10 of chapter 4, Moses said to the Lord, Oh my Lord, I am not eloquent. Either in the past or since you have spoken to your servant, but I am slow of speech and of tongue. And then the Lord said to him, Who has made man's mouth, and who makes him mute, or deaf, or seeing, or blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Now therefore go, and I will be with your mouth and teach you what you shall speak. So he's trying to get Moses to just trust him and to trust that as he goes in faith that God is going to empower him and help him. But Moses is still not buying it. He's still not buying it. And so verse 13, but he said, "Oh my Lord, please send someone else. Please send someone else." And so then the anger of the Lord was kindled against Moses. And he said, "Is there not Aaron, your brother, the Levite? I know that he can speak well. Behold, he's coming out." See, he had already had Aaron on the way. So God wasn't caught off guard by this, but he has Aaron on the way to be Moses' helper and to be the spokesperson. Moses is going to tell Aaron what to say, and Aaron's going to speak, and they're going to do it together. So God is accommodating his unbelief here and his doubt, his self-doubt. And he says, basically, you go, and your brother Aaron's going to help you, and I'm going to give you some signs. So we see that he's going to give Moses and Aaron some signs so he can help to build up the faith, to capture the attention of the people he's got to go talk to, and to tell them, because they're going to hear, oh, God's going to deliver us from slavery into Egypt, and they're going to have great doubt themselves. So he tells them that he'll be able to turn his staff, like the shepherd's staff. He can throw it down and it'll turn into a serpent, and then he can pick it back up and it'll turn into a staff again. He'll be able to put his hand in his cloak and take it out, and it'll be leprous, and he can put it back in and it'll be healed again. So God is going to accommodate the unbelief of Moses, but also of these people. He's going to work with them where they are. And so Moses is concerned. He expresses this to God all the way through chapters 3 and 4. He's afraid. He's afraid the people, when he goes to call them out to say, hey, the Lord wants you out of Egypt to worship Him. And this is God's plan, is to free these people so that they can freely worship Him, the one true God, the creator of the heaven and the earth. And so Moses is concerned as the people won't believe him. So faith here is crucial to this story. But God is working with the people, just like He worked with Abraham. Remember, Genesis 15 tells us that in that story, Abraham believed God, and He accounted it to him as righteousness. But then there were also times where Abraham tried with him and Sarah. They schemed, and then they tried to take matters into their own hands and do things their own way. So God was working with them. All of this is a work in progress, and this is a greater and greater revelation of who God is, to remind this people of God's plan for them. And so He calls him to go back into Egypt to deliver this message. In verse 21, go ahead and look at verse 21 of chapter 4. And it says, "And the Lord said to Moses, when you go back to Egypt, see that you do before Pharaoh all the miracles that I have put in your power. But I will harden his heart so that he will not let the people go." He's foreshadowing what is to come. He's just telling him this is what's going to happen, and we'll talk about this hardening of his heart here in just a second, a little bit more. "And then you shall say to Pharaoh, thus says the Lord, Israel is my firstborn son." Now, Israel, he says, is his firstborn son. What does that imply? Now, what was the promise to Abraham? I'm going to keep reminding us of that. God has to remind us of that all the time. That he and his descendants would be blessed too, so that all other families would be blessed in them, right? So the implication of Israel being God's firstborn, He doesn't say His only son, right? Israel's the firstborn, so there's other children. So that's implied right here. And so, but you have to go back and remember, that's what God intended all along. So this plan for Israel is not just for Israel, it's for the nations, all of the nations of the world. That's the big picture. We always have to keep in mind that's the big picture. And so, anyway, so go back to verse 22 there. He says, Israel is my firstborn son. I say to you, let my son go, that he may serve me. So the purpose of this deliverance is so they will be free to serve and to worship God. And if you refuse to let him go, behold, I will kill your firstborn son. So he's already setting the stage here for what's to come. But again, in this story, as we'll see, it says, first he says, I will harden Pharaoh's heart. And there's this word harden in Exodus. There's three different Hebrew words that are translated harden. And sometimes it's God saying, I will harden Pharaoh's heart. In this case right here, it means to make it strong and firm. He's going to make Pharaoh resolute in what he's already decided he's going to do. So he's going to, the Bible actually warns about this, that sometimes people insist on having things their own way and doing things their own way. And sometimes one of the worst things that can happen to someone is God actually giving you over to your own desires and giving you what you want. You know, remember Garth Brooks, y'all? I thank God for unanswered prayers. So sometimes God giving people what they actually want and are determined to do is one of the worst things that can happen. God is going to give Pharaoh an abundance of opportunities. Okay? He's not going to immediately go to the death blow. As we will see in the story, he goes through 10 different stages of signs and wonders, also called the 10 plagues, where he's trying to get Pharaoh's attention so that Pharaoh will just simply allow the people to go free. Sometimes it says that God hardens his heart. Sometimes it says that Pharaoh hardens his own heart. In this case, it's to make it strong or firm. And sometimes when it says Pharaoh's heart was hard, sometimes the word is the Hebrew word for heavy. His heart was heavy. Now, when you and I talk about having a heavy heart in our culture today, what are we talking about? We're sad. Well, this is not the American culture. This is the Egyptian culture of ancient Egypt. And so to make his heart heavy, you want to kind of think of the balance, the scales of justice. So Carmen Imes, she's a scholar that's done a lot of good work on this. So you think about the scales of justice. So scale on this side and a scale on that side. And if you put a weight, it gets heavy and goes down. So he is making his own heart more and more unjust. And he is accumulating through that. He's going to be accumulating more and more of deserving of justice and God's justice that God's going to bring, because he keeps refusing to just simply do the right thing. And he's not only hurting himself by doing this, he's already hurting Israel. It has been hurting Israel greatly. He's oppressing Israel. He's enslaved them and enslaved them in a harsh way. But through his stubbornness and his refusal to just simply do the right thing, he's now going to continue to open up more and more harm for his own people. Have you ever wondered or thought about we might sometimes have leaders that are so stubborn and hard-headed and who just simply refuse to do the right thing, that they not only bring harm to themselves, but they can bring harm. Leaders can bring harm to a lot of people. Now, a lot of times, I think, we oftentimes think that maybe in the ancient world, these people like Pharaoh, these kings, they were just absolute, they had absolute power. There's no human leader in the world who's ever had absolute power, okay? The will of the people has always been at play. So a lot of times people, when their leaders are doing things, even if the leaders are doing things that are wrong, the people keep cheering them on. They keep, cheering for them. Because they want to support their leaders, right? So they go along. People a lot of times just go along with their leaders just because they're my leaders, they're our leaders, they're from our country, or whatever the case may be. So at any rate, this is what's going on. Pharaoh's making his heart more and more deserving of judgment. That's what it means. His heart became hard or heavy. And so there's another word that's used. I can't remember what it is now, but there's three different words that are used. The English always just translates it hard or hardened. But God is not making Pharaoh doing anything, but He is allowing him to have his own way. And through it all, He's going to bring judgment not only on the people of Egypt, but also on the gods that have captivated the hearts and the minds, and the idols and the gods behind those idols of Egypt. So, let my son go that he may serve me, and if you refuse, this is what's going to happen. But that is a delayed judgment. God gives Pharaoh plenty of opportunity. So the Bible is teaching us that, yes, if we continue to act and behave in wicked ways, that we better be prepared for the consequences, because they're going to bring consequences. When we live in a way that we're not designed to live, there's going to be consequences that we have to be prepared for. I think about this silly example I've used all the time since these things have existed, but this thing, y'all hold yours up. I know you got one. Everybody hold your smartphones up. So these things, there's no way anybody would believe these just came about by an accident of, a whirlwind in a junkyard or anything like that. These were designed by a designer for a purpose, right? Now, the purpose, if I were to take this and say, hey, let's go play softball out in the field out here, and I get up to pitch, and instead of having a softball, I have my phone, and you're getting ready to bat, and I want to throw you my phone, that's crazy, right? Because what's wrong with that? This was not designed for that. So if we do that, there's going to be serious consequences, right? And so the Bible is just teaching us humanity. We can't do whatever we want to do with impunity and think that we're never going to suffer the consequences. So we have to be prepared. But the consequences aren't just because of random chance. The consequences are because of the judgment of God. But this God this is what we got to see. He is a very patient. He's a long-suffering God. He's not quick to judge. He wants to give everybody an abundance of opportunity. So that's the God of the Bible. Now there's this really weird story, and I could skip over it, but I want to get into it because this was one of those passages. I remember I was teaching Bible in 90 Days class, leading it, and a young lady that was taking that, she grew up in church, but part of that was, like I've encouraged many of y'all to do, to go ahead and read through the Bible. I know Judy says she's in Leviticus, and she's not going to let Leviticus deter her from reading through the rest of the Bible. Because a lot of times you can start out a Bible reading plan and you get to Leviticus, but really a lot of the stuff in Leviticus starts in Exodus. And because what you're reading at the end of Exodus, we'll see some of this next week, and in Leviticus is instruction manuals. And us men especially, we don't like to read those. So it can be challenging, okay? So, but at any rate, we were going through this, and she was just reading through, and she got to this passage we're going to look at here, right after this warning about Pharaoh's firstborn son. She was like, what is going on here? She said, Pastor Cliff, I'm not sure I even like this God of the Bible because he seems to be too harsh. And so this is what she read. Chapter 4, verse 24, it says, so Moses is apparently on his way. He's taken off. He's got his wife. He's got his own son. And this is one of those strange stories that makes you go, scratch your head and go, At a lodging place on the way, the Lord met him, Moses, and sought to put him to death. What? What is going on? Then Zipporah took a flint and cut off her son's foreskin and touched Moses. So she cut off the foreskin of the son's reproductive organ, let me say. Okay. To euphemistically, say it euphemistically. So, circumcised him. So what's going on here? And then she took the foreskin and she touched Moses' feet with it. Now, the word feet, sometimes in the Bible, guess what? It means feet. That you put your shoes on. Sometimes it means, it's a euphemism. Y'all know what a euphemism is? A euphemism is a figure of speech. You say something that's maybe a little impolite in public company. You say it in a softer way. And so this could be a way of referring to Moses' male reproductive organ. Okay? And so, boy, that sounds strange. So circumcision is in play here. Now this is where we got to think, what is circumcision? Where do we first hear about circumcision? It was Genesis 15. And it was to be a sign, or a sign and a symbol of this covenant people. And Abraham was to circumcise himself and his whole household. He circumcised his son, Isaac, 8 days old. Ishmael, poor fellow, was a teenager. Okay? God bless him. Okay? So it was a sign of their identity as a covenant people of God. So Moses was raised an Egyptian. He was raised in an Egyptian household and as an Egyptian. And so he himself may not have been circumcised, but his son here in Midian was not circumcised. So this is one of those points where God is testing him to, the best way to put it, God is testing him. Remember, he tested Abraham in a very serious way, right? Genesis 22, by calling him to sacrifice his son Isaac. Here he's testing Moses to make sure Moses is ready to identify himself and his family as no longer Pharaoh's son, or the son of Egypt, but he is clearly identifying himself and his family as a part of this covenant people of God. That's what's going on here. And so the test comes to establish this identity for Moses. So he's clearly in his heart and his mind and his allegiance, he's in the camp of the people of Israel. That's what's going on, I believe, in this story, to the best of my ability, and I think that's what's happening there. So that's vitally important. Moses needs to know who he is and whose he is before he goes back into Egypt. So the story goes on. He goes back into Egypt, and he goes to Pharaoh with his brother Aaron, and they say, hey, the God of our ancestors is calling his people to be able to worship him freely. Let my people go. And so he goes, this story will go back and forth with Moses going to Pharaoh, Pharaoh refusing and continuing to harden his heart even further, refusing to listen to and allow for the people of Israel to leave. The first thing Pharaoh is going to say is, who is Yahweh? Who is Yahweh? Who does he think he is? Why should I even listen to him? And part of the story is God is going to be showing Pharaoh and showing the Egyptians, but especially showing the Israelites who he is. And he's going to reveal that he is a God who has greater power than all of the gods of Egypt. So the story goes back and forth through all of these signs and wonders. The turning of the water, the Nile into blood, the epidemic and the proliferation of frogs and gnats and locusts and the darkness that is so dark you can't see, but you can also feel the darkness. And in all of those cases, God always He's bringing judgment on Pharaoh and Pharaoh's people, Egypt, but He's always making a distinction when He's doing that between the Egyptians and between the Israelites. The Israelites they're not afflicted with the plagues. So there's this distinction. I remember we were talking about that we were doing the Exodus in a vacation Bible school one year, and there's this little boy, he's about 4, and we were going through this story of Pharaoh, and we're talking about how stubborn Pharaoh was, but we kept going through the story, and this little boy was really kind of he was unfamiliar with the Bible story at all. So I just never will forget, we got to about the 3rd or 4th time, and he just put his hands on his hips, and he's like, "What is wrong with that Pharaoh?" He just couldn't, what is wrong with that Pharaoh? But that's what the thing about Pharaoh is he's hurting himself, but he's hurt the Israelites, but now he's hurting his own people through his own stubbornness and his refusal. But God is continuing to give him ample opportunity. So the story goes back and forth, and that we eventually get to the last and the final sign and wonder in let's look at chapter 6 real quick. So this is a further revelation here from God. Remember I said that the Bible's a progressive revelation where we're learning more and more about God and about God's will as we go from Genesis on through. And so we'll see more of this next week too. Exodus chapter 6, verse 1, it says, "But the Lord said to Moses, Now you shall see what I will do to Pharaoh. For with a strong hand he will send them out. And with a strong hand he will drive them out of this land. And God spoke to Moses and said, I am the Lord." That's the Yahweh. I am the Lord Yahweh. "I appeared to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob as God Almighty." That's the Hebrew word El Shaddai. Anybody ever heard that? There's a song, Amy Grant. I love that song. God Almighty, El Shaddai. "But by my name, the Lord, I did not make myself known to them." So he is revealing himself further in a deeper way here at this point in our story, the Bible story. So look at Exodus chapter 12. Oh, man, I got to go back to... all right, go back to chapter 4 real quick. Look at verse 31. So finally Moses goes and he's telling the people what's going to happen, what he's going to do. And here's a key verse. The Bible teaches salvation by faith all the way through. And so verse 31, it says, "And the people, when they heard Moses and what he was going to do and what God was going to do," it says in chapter 4, verse 31, write it down, highlight it, underline it, write it down. "And the people did what?" Say again? First part of it says, "And the people believed." The people believed. Remember, Abraham believed God, and he counted to him as righteousness. So this is what's going to set all this in motion here. This is key all the way through. And we'll see that again. So Exodus chapter 12. The sign that finally breaks the pride and the ego, for a little while at least, of Pharaoh is what God had said all along, that he would kill Pharaoh's firstborn son. And God instituted to make a separation between the Egyptians and the Israelites. God instituted the Passover. And at the Passover, they were to sacrifice a lamb, and they were to take the blood and they were to smear it on the doorpost of their homes. And at the sight of the blood, the angel of death who would bring this judgment on the Egyptians would pass over the homes of the Israelites, and the Israelites and their families would be spared and protected. And so when God finally brings this judgment on Egypt and Israel is spared through the blood of the Lamb, then Pharaoh finally lets his people go. But he still has a change of heart, doesn't he? After he lets them go and they leave Egypt with a lot of possessions, they leave Egypt and they have this new freedom. Pharaoh changes his mind and he begins to pursue them to bring them back into slavery in Egypt. And so we get to this story where their backs are against the sea and they have nowhere else to go. Look at Exodus chapter 14 here. Look at Exodus chapter 14. And we'll pick up here in verse 10. And it says, when Pharaoh drew near, the people of Israel lifted up their eyes, and behold, the Egyptians were marching after them. And they feared greatly. And the people of Israel cried out to the Lord. And they said to Moses, is it because there are no graves in Egypt that you have taken us away to die in the wilderness? What have you done to us in bringing us out of Egypt? So you see, they still have this fear. They still have this lack of faith, but God is patient with them. He's working with them. Verse 12, is not this what we said to you in Egypt? Leave us alone, that we may serve the Egyptians. For it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness. And so what they're going to be wrestling with from here on out is this opportunity for a dangerous freedom, if you will, or for a comfortable slavery. They're going to be wrestling between a dangerous freedom that God is going to give them or a comfortable slavery. And Moses said to the people, fear not, stand firm, and see the salvation which he will work for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you shall never see again. The Lord will fight for you, and you only have to be silent. And then, of course, the great scene where Moses parts the sea through the power of God, the wind of God, parts the sea, and the Israelites are able to walk across on dry land and get to the other side. And when Pharaoh's armies continue to pursue and they go into the sea comes crashing down on them. And the people are delivered and they receive a newfound freedom and a new birth. Because the New Testament talks about the Red Sea, crossing the Red Sea as a type of baptism. They receive a new birth as a new people with a newfound freedom. But throughout the rest of the story, if you look at, let's close out here with chapter 14, verses 30 through 31 here. And it says, thus, in this way, the Lord saved Israel that day from the hand of the Egyptians. And Israel saw the Egyptians dead on the seashore. Israel saw the great power that the Lord used against the Egyptians. So the people feared the Lord, and they did what? They believed in the Lord and in His servant Moses. So this was a salvation by grace through faith. And we'll talk about the rest of Exodus. We're just going to spend one more Sunday night in Exodus. We'll talk about the rest of Exodus next week.